Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I am Stephen Cruz. I am a talent acquisitions specialist for Gray Television. I am a former news director, former producer, reporter, done a little bit of everything in this business. And I am joined by Nicole Karras, our other talent acquisition specialist tonight, and Mary Green, our South Carolina State House reporter. Thank you for joining us, Mary.
I'm glad to be here.
You've had quite a busy day today. So kind of tell us what all has gone on in your day today, coverage wise.
Yeah, it certainly has been a busy day. Started off by getting a phone call that a state representative had resigned out of nowhere, or at least seemingly out of nowhere. Apparently, he resigned 3 days ago, and we didn't find out about it till today. So, start off with getting that information confirmed. Then we are also preparing for South Carolina's first execution, which is scheduled to be carried out tomorrow. First execution in over a decade, I should say. So, following up on all the different attorney appeals and things they're trying to do to get the execution halted. And then I had a couple meetings to cover at the State House because the work never ends, even when the legislature is not here in Columbia.
So lots going on for the State House and the statewide political reporter. And that's the job of a statewide political reporter. You never know what's coming next. And so we're so glad you could make it with us tonight. We're going to talk about covering your first election. As a news director, this was one of my favorite nights of the year, and I know for most of my staff it was too. Now, I will say, and this is probably and differs everywhere. Yes, we always hear about election night pizza, but in all of my newsrooms, we put together a pretty good spread each year, whether it be barbecue, pizza, subs, you name it. We were going to go a little different than so that it was a little bit extra special night. So, was it pizza all the time for you too?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's mainly been pizza. We had Chick-fil-A once, I think. That was nice.
Okay.
So Mary and I worked in the same newsroom for a handful of years, and I want to say that whether you were with us at KCRG in Cedar Rapids, Mary, we upgraded a barbecue at one point, and
I'm trying to think if I was here for the barbecue.
it was great. You were on the field though, so
yeah, that's true.
Tricky when you're out in the field and then the food arrives in the newsroom.
Yeah, sad times.
So before we jump into the presentation, Mary, tell us a little bit about how you decided to get involved in, I like to say, this crazy industry that we are in, and then more specifically into the politics side of things.
Yeah, well, it was not a straightforward route, and I would have not predicted it while I was in college. I can certainly tell you that. Start off, I wanted to go into sports journalism, essentially wanted to be Aaron Andrews and do the sideline reporting situation. Went to college at Notre Dame, did sports, wrote for the student newspaper the whole time, only covered sports, did not cover news, had a few news internships at my hometown station in Tampa. I enjoyed both of them, both sports and news. So I graduated and said, okay, whichever one I get offered first, I'll go in that direction. If I hate it, I'll switch. Got offered a news job in Albany, Georgia, not for the Gray station, sorry, different competitor station, but got offered a news job there, predominantly covered like city council, things like that. Had no interest in going into politics. Finished up in Albany, got offered a job, as Nicole said, at KCRG in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Moved up to Iowa in January because I have a real knack for timing. Started there, and I was thrown into the political situation because the Iowa caucuses were coming up, which I'm sure everyone on this call probably knows are a huge deal in the political world and a huge deal in Iowa. And you can't work in Iowa without covering the caucuses to some extent. And I was really nervous about it. I was kind of thrown into it. I didn't think I was going to like politics. I covered my first event. I had an absolute great time, and then was basically begging my bosses every opportunity. I want to go to this. Bernie Sanders is playing baseball at the Field of Dreams. Let me go to that. Pete Buttigieg is at a elementary school. Let me do that. Joe Biden is here. Had a great time. And then when I finished up my time in Iowa, I figured, hey, I think I want to go, full-fledged into this political world, and discovered that this State House job was open here in Columbia, South Carolina, which works for 7 Gray stations that are either located in South Carolina or cover parts of South Carolina. And that's what I've been doing for about the last 3 years.
What have been some of your favorite moments?
Oh my gosh. I mean, the caucuses were definitely memorable because we didn't get results for like a week after. So that was a pretty wild time. I mean, I honestly, I love covering the state house. It's not for everyone. Some days, people don't want to sit in a 7-hour debate or a 3-hour hearing, but I enjoy it. And honestly, there hasn't been a single day where I'm like, I regret taking this job. I enjoy it every day, and to this point, I'm the only TV reporter in South Carolina to interview Donald Trump of this election cycle. So I got that going for me. So that's definitely been a memorable thing so far.
So, any other memorable interviews? Any moments there when you were doing the interviews, like, oh, I've got you, or anything like that?
I wouldn't say I was very nervous about the Trump interview because I just didn't know what to expect. I've never been so prepared for an interview in my life. But that was an interesting one because with a lot of doing interviews with politicians and candidates, you never quite know if you're actually going to get the interview until it actually happens, especially those who are actively in office, or someone like Trump who has been in office. They're on such tight schedules, and if one thing gets delayed, then the whole dominoes, they could all fall over after that. So it was the whole day just sitting there being like, well, he has a rally in South Carolina, his plane is delayed. Are we going to do the interview? Are we not going to do the interview? And then, his team comes and pulls us halfway through the rally and says, okay, we're doing it. And then just kind of waiting there in anticipation.
Wow. So shameless plug here for a job opening we have at the moment, but we do have a statewide reporter position right now for Alabama. If you are watching this or interested in politics and have some experience, that's a great opportunity that we've got in Gray. And if you're interested, reach out to one of us and we'll be glad to talk to you about it. In addition to our statewide reporters, we also have a DC bureau. And before we jump in the presentation, I just want to give you a little quick look at what our DC bureau does. They have all kinds of things that going on there. So let's take a look at that.
From the nation's capital, I'm Deborah Alfarone.
In a blockbuster case that could impact the 2024 election,
5.3 billion people use the internet.
High radiation levels demand government accountability.
The first week of testimony is in the books.
People here are calling for an end to anti-Semitism.
The TikTok seller ban bill has been signed into law.
Tribal nations are dealing with a crisis.
New airline rules from the Department of Transportation.
Today is the day.
You can't imagine anything like this.
This is unbelievable.
I am just speechless.
Our station WBTV out of Charlotte has live coverage.
Today, the trial for former President Donald Trump.
Live outside the El Paso County office.
And we're off.
We're in the French Quarter of New Orleans. These facades will soon be where your favorite movies and TV shows are filmed.
We can create jobs. We can help build dreams. I mean, if you can do all that, that's a home run.
Millions of Ukrainians have left.
Traveling around the country, listening to America.
I always wanted to tell stories that uplift people, but also ones that make you think. I'm Deborah Alfarone. Join me for The Good Side.
So let's get started covering your first election. So in 1984, President Ronald Reagan won every state except one. Which one did he lose? You know the answer? Throw it in the chat real quick before I go to the answer. Give you 15 seconds. No cheating by Googling or anything like that. Okay, Alex with the answer already. Alex, Minnesota. And that's because his opponent in 84 was Walter Mondale from Minnesota. So before the election, there's a lot that you're going to want to do to get ready for the election. And I warned some news directors today, review your station's election plan. So every one of your news directors should have some type of election plan in place. It's important that you review that. And then again, know your state election laws. every one of them is different. Mary, for example, you mentioned you are South Carolina, but you also do some with some stations that also have a different state. Do you have to deal with that a lot at this point?
No, not really. I mainly just focus on South Carolina, but there are times when, especially when things will come up and they'll compare it to what Georgia does or North Carolina, because those are the other two states where I have stations. And so sometimes it does come in handy to kind of compare and contrast a little bit, even for folks here in South Carolina to know this is what our neighboring state does, this is what they don't do. So sometimes, but predominantly South Carolina.
For example, I'm in Alabama. We do not do early voting here, whereas other states do. So you kind of need to know that kind of those rules and those regulations before election day. Then it's going to vary on election night what you're doing. You may have a local race that you're covering. You may have a statewide race, depending on where you're at that you're covering. So you need to know that up front. And that's where your election plan comes in so handy. But then you need to know your candidate. Know their cell phone number, if they've got a campaign manager, if they have an election night headquarters, bio info on the candidate, such as his background or fun or interesting facts. What are some of the things, Mary, that you look for when you're trying to put together info on your candidate?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is just getting started as early as possible. I mean, I don't want to say get started now, but now isn't a bad time to get started, less than 2 months out, because the sooner you do start building those relationships with your candidate or candidates, with their campaign staff, it depends. If it's a city council race, that's one thing. If it's a statewide, gubernatorial race or a Senate race, you're probably not going to be directly communicating with the candidate. It'll probably be a member of their campaign staff, but getting those relationships with them so you kind of get to know each other, so that you're not calling them for the first time on election night, trying to figure out where's their watch party going to be, who is my candidate. First of all, maybe you can interview them once or a few times before the election, so then you can have that information.
As the night goes on, they're going to come back to you for a hit or for an interview. And so there's going to be times when they say, okay, you got a minute and a half, you got to make it work. And all you may have is the numbers. So you need background information on your candidate or candidates, fun or interesting facts. Candidate John Doe may have 5 dogs and they're all named after former U.S. presidents. There's always something interesting out there that you can pull to be able to use. I had one time. He had stretched it so long. He was giving me the design looks of the place that the headquarters or the campaign night party was going on. He was talking about the drapes and the carpet. So he had run out of stuff. So make sure you've got plenty to talk about your candidate or their opponent, because as the night goes along, they're going to keep coming to you. So did you know George Washington blew his entire campaign budget on 160 gallons of liquor to serve to potential voters? And so I figured it up through Google. His budget was about $40 to pay for 160 gallons of liquor when he was first elected president. So on election day, again, your schedule is going to vary greatly. So you may come in early, you may come in late, you may have to stay late. So just go ahead and plan for that in your mind and think about that now. Review your election plan again. Make sure that you're constantly looking at it, making sure that you know everything on there. Was that very important to you as well, Mary, to look over your plan?
Oh, definitely. You definitely want to have an idea. And, if you're working for a station, communicating with them about what their expectations are for the night, because I can tell you, and I will preface this by saying it's election night. Anything can happen. As I mentioned with the caucuses, you might not get results for a whole week, but generally, I want to come into the night with a sense of knowing how often do you want to come to me for a hit? Is it every half hour? So I know how often I need to be thinking about a new script or trying to get interviews. Maybe you can get a live interview with your candidate as you're waiting for results. Maybe, again, if it's a bigger race, for example, when South Carolina had the presidential primaries earlier this month, I was not going to get Donald Trump for the Republican primary, even though I was at his watch party, but I had live interviews with our governor, who is a big Trump supporter, our lieutenant governor, our attorney general, big campaign surrogate. So if there's an opportunity to do live interviews, you want to know that ahead of time, because a lot of times those surrogates are on tight schedules. So maybe, again, you coordinate with the campaign ahead of time. Hey, my station is coming to me, a couple times. Is there any way I could get the governor or get someone else, a supporter who might be able to do a live interview with me about why they are supporting this candidate?
So, Nicole, what was your favorite role on election night? Because you've had many.
I'm operating without a mouse. My apologies. I would say my favorite role was kind of the one to speak with the analyst on election night. So, I loved being out in the field, but it was also a great experience to be in the studio and be the one the anchors toss to. And, we talk about 2020 in Iowa with no results, and we were live on the air until I think about midnight that night. We had a lot of time to work with. We'll put it that way. And so having an analyst with us who could kind of talk through, this was kind of an unprecedented thing, what was happening, precinct managers who were going to bed without results in, and it was just a wild time. And so being part of having a front row to history that night and then having an analysis to go back and forth with was a lot of fun. And that was a role that I really found to be fun for me because I love politics.
And so let's stop real quick. Let me throw something out there. I know that we all love routines, and I know that sometimes we get too much in our routine. But election day, election night is one of those things where you're not going to have the typical routine you normally would. Mm-hmm. Anything's going to go. Things are going to change throughout the night. And a lot of times I would have someone come back to the newsroom and they would not be real happy about how things had gone because they got changed. Their plans were changed. They're like, I thought it was going to be this. So go ahead and get in your mind now. Things are going to change. There is not going to be a set routine that's just going to work and be perfect all night because we've seen it all. We've seen races that are called early in the night. We've seen races that go into the next day. We had a presidential election at one point that had hanging chads, and it went on for over a month before a winner was determined. So don't think that there's going to be this great, perfect setup for your night. It's going to change, right?
Oh yeah, it'll definitely change.
That's what we love so much about it.
Yeah, and so when it comes to creating a rough draft of your scripts, I can't stress this enough. You can start once you know where you're going and who you're covering. You can get started on this. You're going to probably need a script, but they're probably going to have you in the early shows previewing tonight's results or election night results. Then you're going to have an election result script that's going to be ongoing throughout the night. As new numbers come in, you're going to have something to talk about. And then finally, your election recap script. That's probably going to be your late show script. Hopefully your results are in and you know if your candidate's the winner or loser and you've got sound and all that great stuff. Sometimes you may end up with no sound. They're waiting to see if this last box is going to come in their favor, that type of thing. So you've got to be willing to adjust that. But that's 3 examples of scripts you're going to need and you can start to work on early once you know the plan for your station. Anything either one of you would like to add about those rough drafts for your scripts?
I think the only thing I'd add is having an idea ahead of time, going into the evening for your candidates with these scripts can give you an idea because you're probably going to be doing multiple hits about how you can vary your hits from hit to hit. So for example, outside of the presidential primaries earlier this year, the last big race I covered was 2 years ago. We had our gubernatorial election. And I covered the governor a lot. Obviously, I covered the state house. So I'm very familiar with the governor and had been obviously going to a lot of his campaign events along with his opponent's campaign events. But I was on the Republican Party that evening. He's Republican. And so I knew going into the night, okay, I can talk about, what has he done for the last, I think at that point he had been governor for like 7 years or so, for the last 7 years. Looking ahead, another hit, what does he want to do with another term? Looking ahead, if he won re-election and finished out his term, which he did win re-election, he will become the longest serving governor in South Carolina history. How can I use sound? And that I had already asked him, what that moment means to him. So thinking about, those scripts ahead of time can also help you differentiate your hits throughout the hours or throughout the evening. So you're not saying the same thing over and over and over again. Because I can tell you, there will be people who say the same thing over and over again. And as a reporter, you just get tired of saying the same things. And certainly, like, your viewers don't want to hear it either. So it'll help you kind of break out of that mold.
It's also, I agree. It's also important to have plenty of video, because if you're going 2.5 minutes, you don't want the video to go black or them to restart it. And viewers are seeing the same thing over and over again. In most cases, you're going to have plenty of opportunity to find video of your candidate and create a lengthy video to be able to use. Double check it. If you've gotten it ready before election day, go ahead and double check again. Make sure it's dropped in your server and it's in a folder where they can find it if something happens or goes wrong. So always think about that kind of thing. Make sure you have everything you will need for the night. If you're going out in the field, make sure your camera gear is all good to go. Make sure you check it the day before, turn around and check it the day of. Make sure nobody between the time you left the day before and the time you got back took a battery out of your bag or took your memory card out for some reason. Make sure you've got extra batteries, extra memory cards, extra batteries for your mics, a cord for your mic in case a wireless goes out, you've got a backup. Make sure that you have your live unit. Also, make sure to have an app on your phone as a backup for you. Every one of the live units has an app feature, and it's easy to download. They do it beforehand because the engineering team will need to connect it into the server at the station so that you've got that as a backup in case your live unit's not working for some reason. I don't know how many times, and you two have probably seen this, a candidate will pick an off-the-wall spot to have a rally or an event, and the cell service is almost non-existent. I see it so many times.
You got to love Iowa, right? And then you have to also think if you're competing with cell signal, and there's a lot of cell phones if you're at a large, you're competing with that too.
Mm-hmm.
True. And then last, food. You probably won't get a break throughout the night, so make sure you've got some snacks in your bag. You've got a food plan and a drink plan because you're going to want that. Anything else y'all would add about Election Day leading up to coverage that night?
I would just say if there are any news managers watching, think about crews and goodie bags. I know are always appreciated with some water and some snacks in case the reporter and photographer or any of the news crews forget to pack any snacks for themselves because they are working hard on election night.
Mm-hmm. And not to sound like you're preparing for going to battle or anything, but bring more food than you think you're going to need. And, a Celsius, if that's your kind of, thing to keep you going. I am notorious for bringing the contents of half of my refrigerator, and then I don't eat anything throughout the night because I'm just going off adrenaline. But I'm glad to have it because the odds that you'll get to leave are, I don't want to say non-existent, but pretty close to non-existent.
Yeah. And make sure, hitting off of what Nicole said, if you're a producer, thank your reporters. If you're a reporter, thank your producers, thank your photogs. Make sure you're showing your appreciation to each other for the work that you're doing, because sometimes we forget about that, and sometimes it gets a little tense on nights like this. So think about that as well. Did you know what year was the first election machine used? Anybody want to take any guesses in the chat? Anybody on here want to take any guesses? Nicole, you may have looked already, but.
Are you calling me a cheater? I don't know this.
Okay. Anybody want to guess in the chat? Last chance. 1892 was the first time an election machine was used. On election night, communicate with your station. I cannot stress this enough. We're in the communication business, and sometimes we do a bad job of communicating. And Mary's over there, I can see, grinning from ear to ear about this one. So do you have something you want to chime in on?
No, I'm just thinking of all the election nights, all the various messages you send that are like, so-and-so coming, candidate coming now. No, just kidding. They're not coming to the podium. Of how, I'm an over communicator. So I am constantly okay, campaign says we're 5 minutes out and 5 minutes turns into 10 minutes. So it's one of those better to be safe than sorry, but something always ends up going awry. But at least you did your job to communicate.
And being in that statewide role, you probably are a lot better at it than most because you have to communicate with so many stations every single day. So you've gotten this down to a science, I'm sure. But you do.
Oh,
you
yeah.
just have to. I mean, whether it be text, email, whatever your station decides is the plan to use that night, whether it be, again, a group text or an email. But communicate with your station. Make sure you have the winner for your newscast. This is important. Everybody's going to be jockeying to get that winner. You need to make sure that you've got your grip on the winner. You want them for a live, possibly at your late newscast, and you want sound for later on in other newscasts. So make sure you have the winner for the newscast. Make sure your script is complete. Sometimes you're going to be right down to the wire with this. What's the closest you two have had one script-wise on election night?
I've committed
even
the
written
cardinal
one.
sin of not having a script.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
we need scripts. I mean, there are a lot of stations now have live closed captioning, which is great to have because we do have rules we need to follow for closed captioning. But I mean, election night's a seat of your pants situation, and you do your best to get information in there, and sometimes just providing outline of a script so there's information that can be scrolled for closed captioning just in case you don't script in there that can be easily adjusted by someone back in-house is ideal. So even having something rough that can be pasted into a script line that can be adjusted on the fly is a good idea.
If you can just put some bullets in there, that's better than nothing. What about you, Mary?
Yeah, I hate to admit it. I'm usually just kind of free flowing on election night, but a lot of that is because the whole show is typically free flowing, especially if your station is in wall to wall coverage, for the duration of the evening or extended coverage, or even if it's, on CTV. It is very fast paced and very minute by minute of, okay, results just got called. Here are the results. Anchors read them. Let's toss out to the reporter who's at the winning campaign. What's it like out there? Kind of describing the environment, and then to come back to you when the candidate gives their victory speech or their concession speech if you're at the losing campaign. So it is a very free flowing night. But I understand the importance of having at least some sort of bullets or script.
Are there additional storylines? You can be surprised real quick on this one, from a dead candidate on the ballot winning an election to a candidate that has resigned for whatever political scandal or reason that still wins on election night, to one of my favorite shows is The West Wing. It's an old political show, but the last season the vice president died on election night. It was so crazy things and crazy storylines will happen. A fist fight breaks out at your campaign rally. What is the additional storyline that you can bring back, or the story that you can take and use the next day, even for your news station? Are there any other sound bites you can get for your story? And Mary, you kind of dove into this a little bit earlier, but family members or supporters of the candidate, what are some others that you've used in the past?
I mean, mainly, like I said, it's been a lot of, campaign surrogates, folks who are speaking for the candidate. Of course, the candidate themselves, whether they're giving you an interview or it's sound from the podium when they give their victory speech, their concession speech. And then, I mean, certainly following up, if this is your race and you're not just on one candidate versus the other, of hopefully, if you aren't able to get the losing candidate that night, of trying to get them the next day or at a later time.
And then the next thing, digital. I can't stress this enough. We at Gray really push digital first. We want to get plenty of digital content throughout the day and night. From the early in the day, maybe the candidate headed to the poll to vote for the first time as a candidate, or coming out, he might have a quick soundbite to give that you can get up on digital before newscasts, to when you get out to your headquarters for the evening, or your location for the evening, Do a Facebook Live, do an Instagram Live, do a TikTok Live, whatever. But be very active on social media throughout the night. Put a longer form interview on social with the winners, sound bites that you can't get in your newscast that night or the next day even. And then make sure that your web team has an updated story up for you on the story or the race that you're covering for the night. Anything either one of you would like to add on that?
Just how far digital has come. I mean, really, to be kind of an afterthought, and now it's the first place people tend to use before they sit down and watch coverage on TV. So don't have digital as being something that's extra. Think of it as being something that is urgent and very much appreciated by our news consumers.
I think every one of our stations now has a digital news desk, and I know that even back 4 years ago, we were doing some digital only election coverage that night when we were not necessarily in live wall to wall because the network had it. So we did some of that. It played very well. We got some viewer comments that they would ask questions. We'd try to answer them through the digital platform. So by all means, push digital, push your viewers that are your followers on digital to follow your content there, but not only there, but on your website, your station's website, your station's social platforms as well. How many delegates are needed to win a presidential election? This is a pretty easy one, but I'll give you just a second to throw your answer out there. I like doing trivia. I like finding interesting facts like George Washington blowing his whole budget on alcohol for his first election. And so the answer to this one, of course, is you need 270 delegates to win. That's why we talk about swing states so much. So it's going to be a busy day, but there's going to be lots of downtime in that busy day. And we just kind of talked about it a little bit. Arrive early. Most campaign rallies have limited space on risers, so you want to be there early to get the best location for your coverage. How many times have you faced this, Mary?
Oh my gosh. And I get anxiety over timing. So I arrive like notoriously early, like hours early to things. But no, at least for me, getting there early, sometimes, they have designated spots for stations, but other times it is just a free for all. And for me, that's part of I think at least establishing some sort of comfort and preparation on election night, knowing that I have my space. If you're with a photographer, if you're live, that you're not crammed in one little area. At least you can set your stuff up, make sure you have your lighting correct, make sure if you have a box, you have your box where you need to be. It's going to be tight probably, especially if you're on a riser, but at least you can do whatever you can to give yourself as much space as possible. Get a little comfy.
I mean, we've had a couple of instances I know where some reporters would call, I don't have any space on the riser. I said, well, make some, so you've got, don't be late. Get there early so that if they open early, you can get on in there and get yourself set up. A lot of them are going to have some type of box system that you can hook into audio. So make sure, again, you've got cords for all that. But in most cases, your engineers are going to take care of you and make sure you've got everything you need. Again, post on social media. You have the time, so take advantage of it by posting. Make sure to use all platforms because you've got different followers on every platform. Go live on social media. We talked about that just now. And then again, stand-ups and look lives. Early in the night, you should have time to record a stand-up and a look live for the morning show. They're going to need your content the next morning. Then they want it new, fresh, something different. It's also going to look great on your reel. Anything, Nicole, you want to add to the busy day, lots of downtime?
It's up and wait situation, and that's part of it. Because you'll feel like you're saving energy and then you're going to expel all that energy in a matter of what will feel, but will actually be more like hours because you run on adrenaline and just be prepared for that.
Exactly. After the election, double check your results. Some may have changed overnight. Some of those absentee ballots may come in or provisional ballots, depending on where you're at. It's all going to be different. is there community reaction that you need to get the next day? Because sometimes there is. A candidate that was a longtime candidate for superintendent may have been defeated, and some people want to talk about it. Does your candidate have a plan that would be a good story? Because sometimes our candidates say, oh, I'm going to do this, this, and this. Have you fact checked it? Have you made sure that it's even something that's doable as a plan? Is there a recap story needed after the election on the race that you were covering? And then again, any fact checking needed. Anything y'all want to add to this one? It's pretty simple, pretty cut and dry. But
I think if anything went awry on election night, whether, in a certain county, if their election systems crashed or whatever, or something really big, like we mentioned with the caucuses 4 years ago, that's definitely worth a follow-up as well about, what was the issue? Did they figure it out? How will they ensure this doesn't happen again next time? There are certainly accountability stories that can be done from that standpoint. It hopefully all goes well on election night, but it seems that never happens.
No, typically something's going to happen. A voting precinct is going to come in late, or a voting machine is going to malfunction throughout the day, and they're going to have to go back and hand count something. So just be prepared and be able to explain to your station what's going on.
I would also add, Stephen, just one shout to all my fellow morning show warriors. I did the morning for more than 10 years, and oftentimes volunteered to come in at night, took a little sweet nap on a couch, and got the morning show because I had a major case of FOMO and I wanted to be there on election night. But in the morning are always going to be appreciative of anything you're able to cut for them, to information you're able to provide for them for the morning after the election, and able to do a look live, and likely this is going to be part of your election plan. So just be aware of what's expected of you or what you can do to kind of help the morning show the day after the election.
Absolutely. The more you can provide them, the happier they're going to be that next morning. So some student resources. I started digging into some options that are out there. One of them is a website. And here's the thing. I've created a spreadsheet that I will email to everybody that was on this event tonight so that you can have the links to all of these resources. But there is one out there, the Student Press Law Center. They actually have a free legal hotline that they have a lawyer that can help you if you have questions about this or any other press related thing. They also have a public records letter generator, which is a good thing to have. They have a campaign photo exchange opportunity, and then they have some story ideas up for your election coverage. So something really good to look at is the Student Press Law Center. Also, the Federal Election Commission. They have resources for journalists. They have a whole section that talks about campaign finance law, fundraising and contribution info, and then voting and ballot access info, because we got to talking about this the other day at the weather conference that Nicole and I were at. Alabama, for example, doesn't have early voting, and other states do. And so every one of the states' laws is dictated by the state when it comes to the voting and ballot access. So you need to be familiar based on what state you're in. The other resources that are out there, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. They have an election legal guide, both in Spanish and English, and they have some specific info on battleground states that you might be interested in. The Night Election Hub. Check with your school or station on this. It's a login site, but most schools and stations or ownership groups have information and have access to this. If not, you can create an access yourself. Then, of course, IRE has Covering Your First Election. Then there's some other sites, opensecrets.org, 538, the State Ethics Commission sites, and every one of our states has one of those. And then journalistresources.org. What is some of your favorites, Nicole and Mary? We'll start with Mary.
I live on the South Carolina State Election Commission website, because and I'm sure other states are like this as well. So if you want to dive in, it's a great resource, because a lot, at least here in South Carolina, all the filings are public information and they post them online. So the candidates have their cell phone numbers on these filings, all sorts of information to get in contact with them, which is great for the ones who win seats in the legislature. So I have their phone number later on.
That's a great point.
Yeah. In addition to all, just familiarize yourself with county auditor pages. And I don't know how many times we call up a county auditor's cell phone on election night if there were to be an issue, or if turnout be, a big storyline for the night. It's just nice to familiarize yourself with who the auditor is, how often they're updating their own website, and then grabbing their cell number before election day when they're extremely busy. So you can even just send text if you've got a question or are looking for information, or maybe even an interview if a turnout tends to be a story.
So you mentioned the other day another one that you like, 538.
I do like 538. It's a collection of polls from around the country, and they do a great job of laying it out in graphics that are super easy to understand, and they're really interactive. Now, what I say about this is sometimes I will look at the information there and then check it with the original poll data. I'm kind of a data nerd. And so it just is nice to have a starting point with 538. You can point out a trend, and then I can cross-check it with some other information. Here in Iowa, the Des Moines poll is a big one. And it also rates polls on trustworthiness. And so it's just been a great resource to follow. So if you're curious about polling, you can check that one out.
And this is going to show my age a little bit, Nicole, but one of my favorite on election day is I love to go to Drudge, because he's getting all kinds of articles from all over the country, and he's got those early exit polls coming in. And that's always an interesting thing for me to look at and see what the big surprise of the day is, because generally he's got some off the wall story out there. So if you've got questions, obviously, please throw them in the chat now. And we do have one question that I'm going to throw up there, and I'll let each one of you just kind of weigh in. And that is Susan Murphy wants to know talk about covering ballot initiatives.
Ballot initiatives as in like referendums? Is that what we're kind of talking about?
I think so. I think that. And Susan, if you want to be more specific, by all means, throw another question in there and we'll jump on it. But
I think so. We talk about covering ballot initiatives. These are usually things that, kind of depending on what the topic is, it's whether we have a report on that story or having producers, which I do want to put a pin in that, because I want to talk about a producer election night too, for anybody who might be behind the scenes on this call and looking for a little bit of advice. So we can come to that. But, we talk about, ballot measures, and let's just pick one that, can be headlines, is abortion. We have, I think there are 11 abortion ballot measures, which is that might be the highest number ever in several states, talking about constitutional rights to abortion. And so, if you've got a group, pro-life, or maybe, a pro-rights group that is holding a gathering, that might be something in your state that you send a reporter to. It's always great to be familiar with whatever ballot measures are on the ballot in your state, so you're able to talk about that, because chances are the candidate who you're assigned, even if you're not maybe in that pro-life or pro-rights gathering, is going to have feelings. So an abortion is one of those where, it may not, depending on what the ballot issue is, fall a party line. So that could also be a storyline for those of you who are in a state who have these topics on the ballot.
And I'll even add to that, because we haven't had any really hot topic ballot referendum since I've been here in Columbia, but we certainly have had some. And that's a great story idea right there going into election day, of explaining to voters, okay, here's what you will see on the ballot. There was one a few years ago we had that was essentially expanding the state's rainy day funds, their reserves. It's not the sexiest topic, I get that, but it's very important because the state needs to have money in the bank in case there's an emergency or something happens. so they don't have to, you know, cut jobs or cut programs, things like that. So it's definitely a great, you know, topic leading into the election to just let folks know, here's what you're going to see on your ballot. And then certainly if it's not something that you can cover on election night, it's a great follow-up the next day or in the days after of explaining, okay, here's what happened with it. Here's why people are excited, not excited, etc.
And she did come back and say referendum, yes. So we hit on it. Micah, let's see what Micah has to say. How is the candidate selected that we cover? Generally, your news director is going to look, or your management team is going to look at what the biggest races of the night are. And they're going to determine, okay, we need people to cover these specific races tonight. And that's kind of how they're going to determine who's going to go where based off of that. And so that's generally, any other ways that you two know, but generally that's how I did it. Mm-hmm. I would look at, okay, we had a senior reporter in the room that I would call in and say, okay, what do you think? This is what I think the big races are this time. Do you agree? Yeah. But then he would throw in, well, we probably need to throw somebody at Sheriff Smith's house because he's going to win in a landslide, but he's going to set a record by being reelected this time. So we need to get a soundbite from him. Something like that that would be off the wall from the standard. But yeah, what about y'all?
Yeah, that's pretty much. I mean, I know right now, like here in Columbia, we're working on our election plan. And so I've been chatting with our managers and our anchors. Okay, from the State House perspective, here are the big races in our DMA that we should have someone on, or at least keep an eye on. But I think from a reporter perspective, even if you aren't the one calling the shots about which races your station is covering, if you feel, you know, very strongly that you should, you know, be covering a certain race or certain candidate, or that you want to, definitely advocate for yourself. I mean, I was in Iowa during the caucuses, I was on the Pete Buttigieg campaign. And part of me thinks I was on that because I was reliably the only reporter who could say Buttigieg without struggling, but because I lived in South Bend while he was the mayor. But part of it was I knew him from when he was the mayor. I knew his background, I knew his biography. So I really felt, okay, I'm going to be the best equipped to cover this candidate because I know who he is. I'm familiar with his platform. I'm familiar with his background. I can also say his name. So that's, you know, brownie points for that.
Yeah. Anything you want to add, Nicole?
I don't think so. I do want to talk about, you know, producers, because let's not forget about our friends who are frantically trying to put scripts and newscasts together on election night. When you were producing, Stephen, I'm going to throw a question at you. Yes. When you were producing, how did you prepare for election night?
So I started several weeks ahead. I went ahead and started building out the rundown, and would go ahead and put the races in. And I will tell you that your graphics package at your station typically will feed election results in based on what the AP is giving at that time. And so we generally knew that we would have to build out those graphics. So you're going to probably have to find candidate headshots, and there's going to be some rural county that doesn't have a headshot of a candidate. So you're just going to have to make it work. But typically now it's gotten a lot easier with social media that you can just send them a message, say, hey, can I use this picture that you've got on your Facebook page? But you need permission to use that picture. So I would start rounding up all those pictures, and we'd start uploading them into the system for graphics, and we'd start building out those graphics. And then once we had them in, we'd put them in their slots, and we would leave them alone, because if you ever start adjusting anything in them, sometimes it would mess the numbers up and you'd have to go back and refix it. But I would start building that rundown out a couple of weeks ahead of time. Okay, this is what I feel like our top story is going to be from the local aspect, because generally we're coming out of national news into local, so they know what the presidential race or a Senate race or something like that is. So I generally want to hit the top local stories when we come to our local newscast. So I'd figure out what's going to be the top one, and then from there kind of build it on down based on, are we going to stay in that same county, or are we going to go county to county, or are we going to mix it up all over? And typically weather got cut to almost nothing as long as there was not weather in the market, because we had so much content we had to get in or felt like we needed to get in, and we knew that We need to do that. And sports typically got the night off as well. And that generally they were going out and photogging for us. So that's how we got the sports folks involved. And so from there, once we got to a couple of days out, management team would go through those rundowns, say, okay, I like this, I don't. Let's adjust this. And then game day, it's like, let's have one printed out for everybody for those early shows. Here's what we think. But, you know, again, things are going to change. The candidate that you thought was going to win in a landslide has just been defeated. And so it all of a sudden becomes your top story. So you have to make sure you're communicating just as much with your reporters out in the field as they are communicating with you.
And sometimes, you know, part of the election plan too will that the person who's covering not just a candidate, but might also be covering some of those ballot initiatives or things that are happening on the Capitol, and will then share that information maybe in like a Google Doc or something. So the producer has access to all that information too, because I've got to think that as you're stacking your news, you've got to also have knowledge of what the big issues are and what you need to be, you know, on, because not every race, not every initiative is going to be presented by an anchor. Some of it will be on the ticker on the bottom line. So you need to know which are those big issues that need to be presented. So did you do a lot of research also for election?
I did a ton of research myself as the news director. I created a lot of this stuff that we talked about tonight. I went ahead and created it for my staff because I knew that this was their first election and maybe that they just didn't have time to do that kind of research. So I wanted to make sure they had good information in front of them. And then if they wanted to add anything to that, they could. But yes, I was always going to do a lot of research ahead of time. And then like ahead of time, let's pull a soundbite that may have been a controversial soundbite 3 months ago when the candidate said it. And now did this play into them losing tonight? And if we've got an analyst that says, I think it did, then you've got that soundbite on hand that you can use too. So a lot of planning goes into it on the producing side, just as much as the reporting side. And that's where those anchors get involved too and help on the producing side if they're not out in the field, helping those producers make those decisions and adjust as adjustments need to be made throughout the night.
You could go back, Mary, to your first election. What's something that you wish you knew then that you know now?
Oh my gosh. I think my very first election was probably some sort of city council race. And I think I had to do some live interviews from someone's living room. So, and that's the other thing I'll say is be prepared for whatever, because especially in smaller markets, it's likely that, at least in my experience, that you're going to be covering a race and not necessarily a single candidate. It's not like, you know, you're covering the governor and one reporter's covering the Republican candidate, one person's covering the Democratic candidate. If you're in a smaller market, you're in charge of the entire race. So knowing where all your candidates are that night, hopefully you just have two of them, but you know, how far are their watch parties from each other? Because if you think, okay, I'm going to start at candidate A because I think they're going to win, all of a sudden candidate B pulls ahead. How quickly can I get to candidate B's home? Will they let me in, or their watch party? They're not necessarily at home, but be prepared because they might be at home. Just kind of knowing, like we talked throughout the evening, of being able to adjust on the fly and make, again, any sort of adjustments that you might need, because you never know how an election night's going to go.
And it may be you're covering, because your county is small and they're all going to be right there together, you're covering multiple races. It's possible. The first election I covered, I decided I wanted to shadow the city clerk for the day and do a story on that in addition to the election. And I got to witness her go through the absentee ballots with the committee, and 2 ballots were disqualified, and the candidate that would have gotten those ballots lost by 1. And those ballots were his sons because they did not have proper signatures. And so it was quite the story. So
Mary's already writing the package in her head. So
yes. Can you imagine?
I hope he's forgiven the sons.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, Anything else that comes to mind? Anybody got any questions out there? We wanted to try to give you as much info as we could tonight. Hopefully not have very many questions, but if you've got questions, we'll answer them.
That's a good point.
So in case no one tells you, anchors and reporters don't wear red or blue, green, purple, yellow, black, and white.
You'll get viewer love mail. You wear either color, and truthfully, and this might have been a bit overboard, the entire week, because a lot of times the whole week was just filled with election type stories. But there's so many other colors to wear out there that's a great reminder to just be mindful of and perception. And it's an unfortunate piece of our jobs that we have to worry and think about, but it's an easy thing that you can do to just avoid that to begin with.
And I'm not sure, I don't remember which one. I do have the link I will send you all, but there was a thing about election selfies at the ballot, because it does vary by state, and there are some rules and regulations there that you have to be real careful about. But I will share that link as well. So Micah, let's see what Micah. Many politicians are clever at avoiding criticism. How do you address topics with a candidate that may not want to speak candidly?
I mean, I'll ask the question. If you're not going to answer it, that's on you. And I probably ask the question multiple times. But I think it's a combination of just some tenacity in acknowledging within yourself that they might not answer it, but I am still going to ask, and I'm still going to press for an answer. And then being prepared, especially if you have some sort of background on the candidate, of, okay, they might not answer the question the way that I think they might answer the question. So how can they kind of skirt the topic? I mean, for example, Donald Trump, he's an obvious one, but preparing to interview him, every single question I asked, I had to think about in my mind, how is he going to turn this into something he wants? And that's the thing that politicians do. They are going to answer the question they want to answer it. So how might they finesse their answer into their talking points? And then how can I finesse it back into my question?
The hardest point about interviewing, and especially on a night like election night, when you're in a crowded room, there are lights everywhere, there's deadlines lingering in the air, a lot going on in your mind. The hardest thing to do is to listen to what they're saying, and sure that topics aren't always going to be easy, but it's our job to ask the question and do our best to get the answer that a viewer deserves. And so continuing to listen, and like Mary said, continuing to ask the question and just really whittle it down to, so yes or no, or so what is your stance? It can be difficult to do, but that's our job. And with time, that does get a little easier, but just try your best to drown out distractions on election night and listen to the candidate.
And I think this was, I think it was Lee Zurich that mentioned this, but that the art of silence. Ask the question and just sit there and wait and see how long it goes before they finally respond. See how long, if you can hold out the wait there. But sometimes you'll get responses by just staying quiet yourself. Let's go to this. Cameron Edwards. What are some tips for building up self-confidence as a reporter producer in general, and specifically during election season?
I think it's one of those things where I don't want to give this answer, but that's the best tip is the more times you do it, the more reps you get under you, the better it's going to be. And, election night itself can be kind of daunting, especially for your first one. If your station has a plan where they're going to come to you for multiple hits, and the first one might be a little nerve-wracking. You kind of have those nerves a little bit, but then you just keep doing them, and it's like, okay, by the end of the night, you're like, oh my gosh, like I've done 15 hits. Well, hopefully not 15. But you get more comfortable as you do more reps.
Yeah, I would just say be prepared. Prepare more than you think you need to prepare, and then more. Being prepared on election night, or being prepared in general, any story, to do your research is just going to give you that confidence to be able to handle situations as they arise, especially on election night, because things will happen. And so having that knowledge and feeling confident that you have done your work ahead of the day is going to be a lot better.
Yeah, to add to what Nicole said, I mean, know your candidate as well as your candidate knows themselves, of knowing what their platform is, a little bit about their background, why they say they are seeking this office or position, really will help you feel more comfortable and confident going into the evening.
Anything else you want to quiz me on, Nicole?
I'll come up with something, I'm sure.
If
Well,
I can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
Sure.
Just going off into the things that you might not think about, like the wearing colors on certain nights. If you are interviewing a candidate, I know a lot of times, especially with social media, you might be tempted to take a picture of you and the candidate. I learned this in Iowa, where we had like a very hard and fast rule about taking pictures with candidates. Just don't do it. Especially, if it's like we're taking a picture together and we're smiling, because people will misinterpret. If you didn't even mean it as, hey, I'm vouching for this candidate, people will misinterpret it in ways that you never thought and might think it's a signal of your support for the candidate. So what I always do in these situations, if I want to post a photo, of the candidate, if I'm with a photographer or someone else is in the room, I'll ask them, hey, can you take a photo of us as we're doing the interview? So it's more like an on-the-job type of interview, instead of like, here's me taking a selfie with controversial candidate X or not so controversial candidate, because again, people will misinterpret it and they will question your bias as you're covering this race, and you just want to avoid that.
I'm glad that rule has stuck with you.
Yeah, it's seared in my brain.
We've had this discussion a few times as a recruiting team. So let's see. We've got another question. We'll take this one, and this will be the last one. What's your advice to break into political reporting? Yes, do research, but from newsroom market perspective.
I mean, I think for me, it's just take any opportunity. If this is something that interests you, take whatever opportunities you can to cover it within your market. You don't have to be within a capital city or within, in DC to cover politics. I mean, like I said, when I was in Iowa, I was forced into it because the caucuses were coming up and everyone had to cover the caucuses to some extent. But then it got to the point where I was really like yearning for every opportunity to cover it. So even if it's something, if you're in a really small market of covering, city council or county commission or whatever it is, things like that, or every state has a legislature. So talking to members of the legislative delegation who live in your area, what legislation they're proposing, what they want to do to address your part of the state, your DMA, and making those connections that lead to further connections and can help build your reel if you want to get into specifically political reporting.
In every one of our small markets, if you're interested in covering politics, you're going to get an opportunity to do so. Mm-hmm. It's going to probably start with your city councilman or city council meetings, those type things, county commission meetings, school board meetings, and then from there, you're going to get to take off and run with it. Not everyone wants to do it, but if you're interested in it and you say so, you're going to get the opportunity more times than not. So go for it if that's something that you're really interested in doing. Well, we've had a great night tonight. We thank you so much for joining us. Again, I'm going to send out that link to all these resources that I've found. If you have some that you'd like to share with us, that would be great as well. You can always email us, and we'll put that in the chat, the email address. But as well, if you have questions just about covering politics in general or anything like that, Mary or myself or Nicole would be more than happy to answer those questions for you. Again, those are our email addresses, and then Nicole's is nicole.karras@graymedia.com. And once again, we were so glad to be able to do this for you tonight, and we hope that you have a great evening and a great election season.